The story begins on a quiet evening in an upscale restaurant, the kind of place where wealthy families often dined, and staff always maintained a polished smile. Among the customers that night was a billionaire father, a man who carried himself with an aura of authority and distance. He was well dressed, his suit crisp and his watch gleaming, and most people recognized him instantly, though no one dared approach him. With him sat his young son, a boy bound to a wheelchair. The child had difficulty feeding himself, his hands trembling slightly whenever he tried to lift a spoon. It wasn't uncommon for the billionaire to bring his son out, but it was also no secret that he kept their interactions minimal. He cared for his son deeply in his own way, but to outsiders it often appeared that his focus was elsewhere, on his business, his phone or his thoughts. That night was no different. As the boy struggled with his food, a young waitress approached their table. She was not remarkable in the way people usually defined beauty, but there was warmth in her smile, a kindness in her eyes that couldn't be ignored. She noticed immediately that the boy was having trouble, and without hesitation she crouched down beside him. Gently she took the spoon and asked softly if she could help. The boy looked at her shyly and nodded, and she began to feed him carefully, speaking to him in a friendly tone as if they were old friends. She asked him what foods he liked, made small jokes to ease his embarrassment, and never once showed pity in her expression. To her he wasn't a billionaire's disabled son, he was just a child who deserved dignity and care. The billionaire, who until then had been distracted by his buzzing phone, looked up. At first he was slightly taken aback. No one had ever dared to get so close to his son without his explicit permission. His instinct was to feel defensive, but as he watched more closely, his feelings shifted. There was something pure in the way this waitress treated his boy. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't performing kindness for tips, and she wasn't uncomfortable in the least. Her gestures were natural, as though she had been doing this her whole life. For a moment, the restaurant's noise faded, and all he could see was his son smiling, a rare, genuine smile as he interacted with the young woman. This simple act began to stir emotions in the father that he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Being a powerful man, he had grown accustomed to skepticism, to people approaching him with motives. But this girl seemed different. She had no idea that the man at the table was one of the richest in the city, and if she did, she didn't show it. Her attention was fully on the boy, and the boy responded to her with joy. The billionaire felt a strange lump in his throat, realizing how often he himself avoided these moments, perhaps because they were too painful, perhaps because he was too busy convincing himself that money and power were the only shields his son would ever need. When the meal ended, the waitress helped clean up around the boy, thanked him for being such a good dinner companion, and stood to walk away with the same energy she gave to all her tables. She didn't linger, didn't try to flatter the father, and didn't expect anything in return. But as she left, the billionaire's eyes followed her. His son tugged gently at his sleeve and whispered that she was nice. Those words, so simple, sank deep into the man's heart. For the first time in a long while, he began to wonder if he had been missing something essential, not just in how he interacted with his son, but in how he understood humanity itself. The drive home was quiet that night. The billionaire's son looked more content than usual, humming softly as they left the restaurant. The father replayed the scene over and over in his mind, unable to shake the image of the waitress kneeling beside his child with such care. It was such a small act, something the world might overlook, but to him it was monumental. For years he had used money to shield his son from cruelty, but he realized in that moment that kindness was something money couldn't buy. That single evening planted a seed of curiosity and gratitude in his heart, one that would later grow into a decision that would change the waitress's life forever. The billionaire could not stop thinking about that night. For a man whose life revolved around numbers, negotiations and boardroom strategies, it was strange to find his mind occupied by the simple image of a waitress feeding his son with such patience. The following week, he made an uncharacteristic decision. He would return to the same restaurant. He told himself it was just for convenience, but deep down he wanted to see her again. When he walked in with his son, the staff hurried to serve them, knowing who he was, but he requested to be seated in the same section where she worked. His son's face lit up when he saw her approaching, which only confirmed the father's thoughts. She greeted them warmly, not in the forced manner of someone greeting a powerful customer, but with genuine kindness like meeting old friends. She bent down to ask the boy how he was doing and whether he wanted the same dish as last time. Her eyes were bright, her voice soft, and she seemed completely unaware of the impression she had already left. The billionaire observed quietly, studying her more closely this time. He noticed the little details, the worn soles of her shoes that seemed close to tearing, the tiredness in her movements that she masked with her smile, and the way she treated every single table with respect regardless of who they were. As the meal progressed, he found himself less focused on his food and more on her. He wondered about her life. Why did she work so hard? What made her so patient with strangers? When she helped his son again without hesitation, something inside him stirred. It wasn't pity or even admiration alone. It was curiosity mixed with respect. In his world, people wore masks and kindness was often transactional. But this girl seemed to carry no mask at all. He realized that her warmth wasn't reserved only for his child. She showed the same patience to an elderly man struggling with his coat, and she smiled encouragingly at a young couple who seemed nervous about their bill. It was as if she carried a quiet light with her, touching people without even realizing it. For the billionaire who had built his empire on power and control, this realization was disarming. He began to feel a strange conflict inside himself. On one hand, he respected her deeply. On the other, he couldn't understand why someone with such spirit and heart was working long hours in a modest restaurant. He found himself asking silent questions. Did she have a family to support? Was she pursuing some dream, but had to set it aside? The more he watched, the more the answers mattered to him. At one point he caught his son looking at her with an expression he rarely saw, pure happiness. The boy, who often shied away from strangers, seemed at ease with her, even laughing at a silly joke she made. That laugh echoed in the father's mind, reminding him of how rare it was to see his child so comfortable. He began to realize that this waitress had given him something his wealth could not buy, a glimpse of his son's joy, and for that he felt an unspoken gratitude. When the meal ended, he did something unusual. Instead of leaving silently as he always did, he asked for her name. She seemed surprised, a little cautious, but she answered politely. He thanked her, not just for the service, but for the kindness she had shown his son. She smiled, brushing it off as though it was nothing extraordinary, and moved on to her other tables. But for him it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of a deeper curiosity, one that he couldn't let go. That night, as he drove home, the father thought about how rarely he took the time to notice people outside his own circle. He had lived in a world where wealth created distance, yet this young woman, with no riches or power, had managed to bridge that distance effortlessly. He wanted to know more. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about deals or markets, but about a waitress whose kindness lingered in his mind. Something told him that her story was far more important than he yet understood, and he felt a quiet determination building inside him to discover it. Days turned into weeks, yet the billionaire could not shake the thought of the waitress from his mind. His life had always been about control, about knowing every detail before stepping into any venture, but this time curiosity drove him in a different way. He found himself visiting the restaurant more often, always with his son, always choosing the same section where she worked. Each time he would notice more about her. Her smile remained constant, but he began to recognize the exhaustion behind it. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, yet there were tiny moments where her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking. These glimpses, subtle but undeniable, told him that beneath her cheerfulness was a woman fighting battles of her own. He began to ask small, casual questions during their interactions. At first she was polite, keeping her answers short, as if she was used to people asking out of obligation rather than interest. But slowly, with the consistency of his visits and his genuine tone, she opened up. He learned that she worked double shifts most days, sometimes skipping breaks to make sure customers were satisfied. She often refused tips from those who seemed to be struggling themselves. When he probed further, he discovered why she worked so hard. She was the primary support for her younger siblings after their parents passed away. Everything she earned went into keeping them clothed, fed, and in school. This revelation struck him deeply. He had assumed she was just another young woman earning some extra money, but now he realized she was carrying the weight of an entire family on her shoulders. She was barely more than a girl herself, yet she had taken on responsibilities that would break most adults. Despite that, she never let her burdens spill into her work. She chose to wear kindness like armor, showing customers a version of herself that radiated warmth even when her own life was filled with struggle. The billionaire felt a pang of guilt as he listened, realizing how many times he had dismissed people like her in the past, assuming they were ordinary without ever considering their stories. His son, too, seemed drawn to her. He spoke more during their meals, asked her little questions, and shared things he rarely said at home. She responded with equal enthusiasm, treating him not as a fragile child, but as a boy deserving of normal conversation and laughter. The billionaire watched these exchanges with a mix of admiration and regret. He had spent so much time trying to protect his son with wealth and distance, that he had forgotten how much simple human connection mattered. One evening, as he lingered longer than usual, he noticed her counting coins behind the counter. Her paycheck was modest, but she seemed to be piecing together every rupee, stretching it as far as possible. He overheard her apologizing to a colleague for not being able to join them for dinner after work because she couldn't afford to spend extra. That night, as he sat in his car with his son asleep beside him, the billionaire's heart ached. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, not because of business but because of the unfairness he saw in front of him. The contrast between their worlds became sharper in his mind. He lived in mansions, traveled in luxury cars, and had more money than he could spend in a lifetime. She lived paycheck to paycheck, sacrificing her own dreams to raise her siblings. Yet in terms of courage and resilience, she was wealthier than anyone he had ever met. He realized he was witnessing a strength far greater than money could buy. The strength of a woman who refused to give up on those she loved. It humbled him. For years he had judged people by their position, their power, and their success. But here was a young woman who had none of those things, yet she carried herself with a dignity that exceeded many of the wealthy individuals he knew. In her he saw a mirror of what humanity was supposed to be: selfless, compassionate, and quietly brave. He began to understand that the reason her kindness toward his son had felt so genuine was because it came from a place of shared struggle. She knew what it meant to feel unseen, to feel small, to be vulnerable. And instead of letting that harden her, she chose to treat others with the care she once wished someone had shown her. That realization left him both moved and unsettled. He could no longer look at her as just a waitress. To him she had become a symbol of something he had forgotten in his pursuit of wealth: the beauty of resilience, the nobility of sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people. He drove home that night, not thinking about profits or deals, but about how unfair it was that someone like her, with so much goodness to give, lived in the shadows of struggle. He knew then that his role in her story was not just as an observer. Something inside him whispered that he was meant to do more. The billionaire spent many sleepless nights thinking about the young woman who had unknowingly left such a deep impression on him. He had watched her kindness toward his son, listened to the fragments of her story, and seen the weight she carried with quiet strength. He knew now that he could not simply walk away. In his world, problems were solved with money, but he also knew that if he offered her help carelessly, she might refuse or feel insulted. She was proud, strong, and independent. Whatever he did had to respect her dignity. One evening he made a decision. He returned to the restaurant with his son, not for dinner this time, but with a different purpose. His son was happy to see her again, and she greeted them with her usual warmth. But when she came to their table, the billionaire asked her if she could spare a few minutes to talk after her shift. She hesitated, surprised by the unusual request, but agreed politely. When her work was finished and the restaurant had quieted down, she joined them at their table, nervous but curious about why someone of his stature wanted to speak with her privately. The billionaire began by thanking her again, not in the casual way he had before, but sincerely, with emotion in his voice. He told her that he had watched the way she treated his son, the way she worked tirelessly, and how she always managed to keep her kindness intact despite the obvious hardships she faced. At first she tried to dismiss his words, saying it was simply her job, that she only did what any decent person would do. But he shook his head gently and told her she was wrong, that very few people had the capacity to give so much when they themselves had so little. Slowly he encouraged her to share more about her life. Hesitant at first, she eventually opened up. She told him about losing her parents, about her younger siblings depending on her, and about the long hours she worked just to keep the household running. Her voice trembled when she admitted she had once dreamed of going to college, perhaps even starting her own business, but those dreams had been set aside the day she became the only provider for her family. She spoke without bitterness, but there was an ache in her words, the quiet grief of someone who had accepted sacrifice as her destiny. The billionaire listened intently, his heart heavy with admiration and sorrow. He thought about how easily his own life had been paved with opportunities, how he had built his empire on advantages she could only dream of, and how different her path might have been if someone had believed in her earlier. He realized then that he could be that person. Taking a deep breath, he made her an offer. He told her he wanted to help, not as charity, but as an investment in someone he believed in. He offered to cover her siblings' education expenses so she could breathe easier. He offered her the chance to go back to school if she wished, or if she preferred, the capital to start a small business she had once spoken of in passing. He explained that he was not doing this because she had served him food or been kind to his son, but because she had shown him what true strength and compassion looked like. He wanted her to have the chance to live her own dreams, not just carry the weight of others. At first she was overwhelmed. Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head, insisting she could not accept something so grand. But the billionaire's son, who had been listening quietly, reached out and held her hand, with the innocence only a child could have. He told her she deserved it, that she had made him feel normal, happy, and seen. That simple statement broke the last of her resistance. She cried openly then, not out of sadness but out of relief, out of the sudden realization that her life might not always have to be defined by struggle. The billionaire promised her that this was only the beginning, that she was no longer alone in her journey. For him it was more than an act of generosity. It was redemption. Through her he had remembered the value of kindness, the importance of human connection, and the truth that wealth only had meaning when it was used to lift others. From that day forward her life began to change. Her siblings continued their studies without fear of being pulled out for lack of funds. She enrolled in classes she had once given up on, and with his mentorship and support, she began to plan for the future she had always dreamed of. The billionaire and his son remained a part of her life, not as benefactors and recipient, but as family bound by respect and love. The boy had found in her a friend, the father had found in her a teacher of compassion, and she had found in them the encouragement to finally live, not just survive. It was a transformation none of them had expected, born out of a single act of kindness in a crowded restaurant. Yet it became proof that sometimes the smallest gestures have the power to change lives forever.